Then the summer came, and the 1 year point from when we'd first arrived. A batch of new students turned up in a minibus, much as we'd done, but none of them were from Hailsham. This was in some ways a relief. I think we'd all been getting anxious about how a fresh lot of Hailsham students might complicate things. But for me at least, this non-appearance of Hailsham students just added to a feeling that Hailsham was now far away in the past, and that the ties binding our old crowd were fraying. It wasn't just that people like Hannah were always talking about following Alice's example and starting their training. Others, like Laura, had found boyfriends who weren't Hailsham, and you could almost forget they'd ever had much to do with us. And then there was the way Ruth kept pretending to forget things about Hailsham. Okay, these were mostly trivial things, but I got more and more irritated with her. There was the time, for instance, we were sitting around the kitchen table after a long breakfast, Ruth, me, and a few veterans. One of the veterans had been talking about how eating cheese late at night always disturbed your sleep. And I turned to Ruth to say something like, "You remember how Miss Geraldine always used to tell us that?" It was just a casual aside, and all it needed was for Ruth to smile or nod. But she made a point of staring back at me blankly, like she didn't have the faintest idea what I was talking about. Only when I said to the veterans, by way of explanation, "One of our guardians," then Ruth gave a frowning nod as though she just that moment remembered. I let her get away with it that time, but there was another occasion when I didn't. That evening we were sitting out in the ruined bus shelter. I got angry then because it was one thing to play this game in front of veterans, quite another when it was just the two of us in the middle of a serious talk. I'd referred, just in passing, to the fact that at Hailsham, the shortcut down to the pond through the rhubarb patch was out of bounds. When she put on her puzzled look, I abandoned whatever point I'd been trying to make and said, "Ruth, there's no way you've forgotten, so don't give me that." Perhaps if I hadn't pulled her up so sharply, perhaps if I'd just made a joke of it and carried on, she'd have seen how absurd it was and laughed. But because I'd snapped at her, Ruth glared back and said, "What does it matter anyway? What's the rhubarb patch got to do with any of this? Just get on with what you were saying." It was getting late, the summer evening was fading, and the old bus shelter felt musty and damp after a recent thunderstorm. So I didn't have the head to go into why it mattered so much. And though I did just drop it and carry on with the discussion we'd been having, the atmosphere had gone chilly and could hardly have helped us get through the difficult matter in hand. But to explain what we were talking about that evening, I'll have to go back a little bit. In fact, I'll have to go back several weeks, to the earlier part of the summer. I'd been having a relationship with one of the veterans, a boy called Lenny, which, to be honest, had been mainly about the sex. But then he'd suddenly opted to start his training and left. This unsettled me a little, and Ruth had been great about it, watching over me without seeming to make a fuss, always ready to cheer me up if I seemed gloomy. She also kept doing little favors for me, like making me sandwiches or taking on parts of my cleaning route. Then about a fortnight after Lenny had gone, the two of us were sitting in my attic room sometime after midnight chatting over mugs of tea, and Ruth got me really laughing about Lenny. He hadn't been such a bad guy, but once I started telling Ruth some of the more intimate things about him, it did seem like everything to do with him was hilarious, and we just kept laughing and laughing. Then at one point, Ruth was running a finger up and down the cassettes stacked in little piles along my skirting board. She was doing this in an absent-minded sort of way while she kept laughing, but afterwards, I went through a spell of suspecting it hadn't been by chance at all, that she'd noticed it there maybe days before, perhaps even examined it to make sure, then had waited for the best time to find it. Years later, I gently hinted this to Ruth, and she didn't seem to know what I was talking about, so maybe I was wrong. Anyway, there we were, laughing and laughing each time I came out with another detail about poor Lenny, and then suddenly it was like a plug had been pulled out. There was Ruth lying on her side across my rug, peering at the spines of the cassettes in the low light, and then the Judy Bridgewater tape was in her hands. After what seemed like an eternity, she said, "So how long have you had this again?" I told her as neutrally as I could about how Tommy and I had come across it that day while she'd been gone with the others. She went on examining it, then said, "So Tommy found it for you?" I said, "No, I found it. I saw it first." "Neither of you told me," she shrugged. "At least if you did, I never heard." "The Norfolk thing was true," I said. "You know, about it being the lost corner of England." It did flash through my mind Ruth would pretend not to remember this reference, but she nodded thoughtfully. "I should have remembered at the time," she said. "I might have found my red scarf then." We both laughed, and the uneasiness seemed to pass. But there was something about the way Ruth put the tape back without discussing it any further that made me think it wasn't finished with yet. I don't know if the way the conversation went after that was something controlled by Ruth in the light of her discovery, or if we were headed that way anyway, and that it was only afterwards Ruth realized she could do with it what she did. We went back to discussing Lenny, in particular a lot of stuff about how he had sex, and we were laughing again. At that point, I think I was just relieved she'd finally found the tape and not made a huge scene about it, and so maybe I wasn't being as careful as I might have been. Because before long, we drifted from laughing about Lenny to laughing about Tommy. At first, it felt all good-natured, like we were just being affectionate toward him. But then we were laughing about his animals. As I say, I've never been sure whether or not Ruth deliberately moved things around to this. To be fair, I can't even say for certain she was the one who first mentioned the animals. And once we started, I was laughing just as much as she was about how one of them looked like it was wearing underpants, how another had to have been inspired by a squashed hedgehog. I suppose I should have said in there somewhere that the animals were good, that he'd done really well to have got where he had with them, but I didn't. That was partly because of the tape, and maybe, if I have to be honest, because I was pleased by the notion that Ruth wasn't taking the animals seriously and everything that implied. I think when we eventually broke up for the night, we felt as close as we'd ever done. She touched my cheek on her way out, saying, "It's really good the way you always keep your spirits up, Kathy." So I wasn't prepared at all for what happened at the churchyard several days later. Ruth had discovered that summer a lovely old church about half a mile from the cottages, which had behind it rambling grounds with very old gravestones leaning in the grass. Everything was overgrown, but it was really peaceful, and Ruth had taken to doing a lot of her reading there, near the back railings, on a bench under a big willow. I hadn't at first been too keen on this development, remembering how the previous summer we'd all sat around together in the grass right outside the cottages. All the same, if I was headed that way on one of my walks, and I knew Ruth was likely to be there, I'd find myself going through the low wooden gate and along the overgrown path past the gravestones. On that afternoon, it was warm and still, and I'd come down the path in a dreamy mood, reading off names on the stones, when I saw not only Ruth, but Tommy on the bench under the willow. Ruth was actually sitting on the bench, while Tommy was standing with one foot up on its rusty armrest, doing a kind of stretching exercise as they talked. It didn't look like they were having any big conversation, and I didn't hesitate to go up to them. Maybe I should have picked up something in the way they greeted me, but I'm sure there wasn't anything obvious. I had some gossip I was dying to tell them, something about one of the newcomers, and so for a while it was just me blabbing on while they nodded and asked the odd question. It was some time before it occurred to me something wasn't right, and even then when I paused and asked, "Did I interrupt something here?" it was in a jokey sort of way. But then Ruth said, Tommy's been telling me about his big theory. He says he's already told you ages ago, but now very kindly he's allowing me to share in it too." Tommy gave a sigh and was about to say something, but Ruth said in a mock whisper, "Tommy's big gallery theory." Then they were both looking at me like I was now in charge of everything and it was up to me what happened next. "It's not a bad theory," I said. "It might be right, I don't know. What do you think, Ruth?" I had to really dig it out of Sweet Boy here. Not very keen at all on letting me in on it, were you, Sweetie Gums? It was only when I kept pressing him to tell me what was behind all this art. "I'm not doing it just for that," Tommy said sulkily. His foot was still up on the armrest, and he kept on with his stretching. "All I said was, if it was right about the gallery, then I could always try and put in the Ruth said, "Tommy, sweetie, don't make a fool of yourself in front of our friend. Do it to me, that's all right, but not in front of our dear Kathy." "I don't see why it's such a joke," Tommy said. "It's as good a theory as anyone else's." "It's not the theory people will find funny, sweetie gums. They might well buy the theory right enough, but the idea that you'll swing it by showing Madam your little animals." Ruth smiled and shook her head. Tommy said nothing and continued with his stretching. I wanted to come to his defense and was just trying to think of the right thing that would make him feel better without making Ruth even more angry. But that was when Ruth said what she did. It felt bad enough at the time, but I had no idea in that churchyard that day how far-reaching the repercussions would be. What she said was, "It's not just me, sweetie. Kathy here finds your animals a complete hoot." My first instinct was to deny it, then laugh. But there was a real authority about the way Ruth had spoken, and the three of us knew each other well enough to know there had to be something behind her words. So in the end, I stayed silent, while my mind searched back frantically and with a cold horror settled on that night up in my room with our mugs of tea. Then Ruth said, "As long as people think you're doing those little creatures as kind of a joke, fine. But don't give out you're serious about it, please." Tommy had stopped his stretching and was looking questioningly at me. Suddenly, he was really childlike again, with no front whatsoever, and I could see, too, something dark and troubling gathering behind his eyes. "Look, Tommy, you've got to understand," Ruth went on. "If Kathy and I have a good laugh about you, it doesn't really matter, because that's just us. But please, let's not bring everyone else into it." I thought about those moments over and over. I should have found something to say. I could have just denied it, though Tommy probably wouldn't have believed me. And to try to explain the thing truthfully would have been too complicated. But I could have done something. I could have challenged Ruth, told her she was twisting things, that even if I might have laughed, it wasn't in the way she was implying. I could even have gone up to Tommy and hugged him right there in front of Ruth. That's something that came to me years later and probably wasn't a real option at the time, given the person I was and the way the three of us were with each other. But that might have done it where words would only have got us in deeper. But I didn't say or do anything. It was partly, I suppose, that I was so floored by the fact that Ruth would come out with such a trick. I remember a huge tiredness coming over me, a kind of lethargy in the face of the tangled mess before me. It was like being given a maths problem when your brain's exhausted and you know there's some far-off solution, but you can't work up the energy even to give it a go. Something in me just gave up. A voice went, "All right, let him think the absolute worst. Let him think it. Let him think it." And I suppose I looked at him with resignation, with a face that said, "Yes, it's true. What else did you expect?" And I can recall now, as fresh as anything, Tommy's own face, the anger receding for the moment, being replaced by an expression almost of wonder, like I was a rare butterfly he'd come across on a fence post. It wasn't that I thought I'd burst into tears or lose my temper or anything like that, but I decided just to turn and go. Even later that day, I realized this was a bad mistake. All I can say is that at the time, what I feared more than anything was that one or the other of them would stalk off first, and I'd be left with the remaining one. I don't know why, but it didn't seem an option for more than one of us to storm off, and I wanted to make sure that one was me. So I turned and marched back the way I'd come, past the gravestones toward the low wooden gate, and for several minutes I felt as though I'd triumphed, that now they'd be left in each other's company. They were suffering a fate they thoroughly deserved. As I've said, it wasn't until a long time afterwards, long after I'd left the cottages, that I realized just how significant our little encounter in the churchyard had been. I was upset at the time, yes, but I didn't believe it to be anything so different from other tiffs we'd had. It never occurred to me that our lives, until then so closely interwoven, could unravel and separate over a thing like that. But the fact was, I suppose, there were powerful tides tugging us apart by then, and it only needed something like that to finish the task. If we'd understood that back then, who knows, maybe we'd have kept a tighter hold of one another. For one thing, more and more students were going off to be carers, and among our old Hailsham crowd, there was a growing feeling that this was the natural course to follow. We still had our essays to finish, but it was well known we didn't really have to finish them if we chose to start our training. In our early days at the cottages, the idea of not finishing our essays would have been unthinkable. But the more distant Hailsham grew, the less important the essays seemed. I had this idea at the time, and I was probably right, that if our sense of the essays being important was allowed to seep away, then so too would whatever bound us together as Hailsham students. That's why I tried for a while to keep going our enthusiasm for all the reading and note-taking. But with no reason to suppose we'd ever see our guardians again, and with so many students moving on, it soon began to feel like a lost cause. Anyway, in the days after that talk in the churchyard, I did what I could to put it behind us. I behaved toward both Tommy and Ruth as though nothing special had happened, and they did much the same. But there was always something there now, and it wasn't just between me and them. Though they still made a show of being a couple, they still did the punching on the arm thing when they parted. I knew them well enough to see they'd grown quite distant from each other. Of course, I felt bad about it, especially about Tommy's animals. But it wasn't as simple anymore as going to him and saying sorry and explaining how things really were. A few years earlier, even 6 months earlier, it might have worked out that way. Tommy and I would have talked it over and sorted it out. But somehow by that second summer, things were different. Maybe it was because of this relationship with Lenny. I don't know. Anyway, talking to Tommy wasn't so easy anymore. On the surface at least, it was much like before, but we never mentioned the animals or what had happened in the churchyard. So that was what had been happening just before I had that conversation with Ruth in the old bus shelter, when I got so annoyed with her for pretending to forget about the rhubarb patch at Hailsham. Like I said, I'd probably not have gotten nearly so cross if it hadn't come up in the middle of such a serious conversation. Okay, we'd got through a lot of the meat of it by then, but even so, even if we were just easing off and chatting by that point, that was still all part of our trying to sort things with each other, and there was no room for any pretend stuff like that. What had happened was this. Although something had come between me and Tommy, it hadn't quite got like that with Ruth, or at least that's what I thought, and I decided it was time I talked with her about what happened in the churchyard. We'd just had one of those summer days of rain and thunderstorms, and we'd been cooped up indoors despite the humidity. So when it appeared to clear for the evening with a nice pink sunset, I suggested to Ruth we get a bit of air. There was a steep footpath I'd discovered leading up along the edge of the valley, and just where it came out onto the road was an old bus shelter. The buses had stopped coming ages ago, the bus stop sign had been taken away, and on the wall at the back of the shelter, there was left only the frame of what must have once been a glassed-in notice displaying all the bus times. But the shelter itself, which was like a lovingly constructed wooden hut with one side open to the fields going down the valley, was still standing, and even had its bench intact. So that's where Ruth and I were sitting to get our breath back, looking at the cobwebs up on the rafters and the summer evening outside. Then I said something like this. You know, Ruth, we should try and sort it out what happened the other day. I'd made my voice conciliatory, and Ruth responded. She said immediately how daft it was, the three of us having rows over the most stupid things. She brought up other times we'd rowed, and we laughed a bit about them. But I didn't really want Ruth just to bury the thing like that, so I said, still in the least challenging voice I could, Ruth, you know, I think sometimes when you're in a couple, you don't see things as clearly as maybe someone can from the outside. Just sometimes. She nodded. That's probably right. I don't want to interfere, but sometimes, just lately, I think Tommy's been quite upset. You know, about certain things you've said or done. I was worried Ruth would get angry, but she nodded and sighed. I think you're right, she said in the end. I've been thinking a lot about it too. Then maybe I shouldn't have brought it up. I should have known you'd see what was happening. It's not my business, really. She said, but it is, Kathy. You're really one of us, and so it's always your business. You're right, it hasn't been good. I know what you mean. That stuff the other day about his animals, that wasn't good. I told him I was sorry about that. I said, I'm glad you talked it over. I didn't know if you had. Ruth had been picking at some molding flakes of wood on the bench beside her, and for a moment she seemed completely absorbed in this task. Then she said, Look, Kathy, it's good we're talking now about Tommy. I've been wanting to tell you something, but I've never quite known how to say it, or when, really. Kathy, promise you won't be too cross with me. I looked at her and said, as long as it's not about those t-shirts again. No, she said, seriously. Promise you won't get too cross, because I've got to tell you this. I wouldn't forgive myself if I kept quiet much longer. I said, okay, what is it? Kathy, I've been thinking this for some time. You're no fool, and you can see that maybe me and Tommy, we might not be a couple forever. That's no tragedy. We were right for each other once. Whether we always will be, that's anyone's guess. And now there's all this talk about couples getting deferrals if they can prove, that they're really right. Okay, look, what I wanted to say, Kathy, is this. It would be completely natural if you thought about, what would happen if me and Tommy decided we shouldn't be together anymore. We're not about to split, don't get me wrong. But I think it was completely normal if you at least wondered about it. Well, Kathy, what you have to realize is that Tommy doesn't see you like that. He really, really likes you. He thinks you're really great. But I know he doesn't see you like, a proper girlfriend. Besides, Ruth paused, then sighed. Besides, you know how Tommy is. He can be fussy. I stared at her. What do you mean? She said, you must know what I mean. Tommy doesn't like girls who've been with, with this person and that. It's just a thing he has. I'm sorry, Kathy, but it wouldn't be right not to have told you. I thought about it and then said, it's always good to know these things. I felt Ruth touch my arm. I knew you'd take it the right way. What you've got to understand, though, is that he thinks the world of you. He really does. I wanted to change the subject, but for the moment my mind was a blank. I suppose Ruth must have picked up on this because she stretched out her arms and did a kind of yawn, saying, if I ever learned to drive a car, I'd take us all on a trip to some wild place. Dartmoor, say. The three of us, maybe Laura and Hannah too. I'd love to see all the bogs and stuff. We spent the next several minutes talking about what we'd do on a trip like that if we ever went on one. I asked where we'd stay, and Ruth said we could borrow a big tent. I pointed out the wind could get really fierce in places like that, and our tent could easily blow away in the night. None of this was that serious. But it was around here I remembered the time back at Hailsham when we'd still been juniors and we were having a picnic by the pond with Miss Geraldine. James had been sent to the main house to fetch the cake we'd all baked earlier, but as he was carrying it back, a strong gust of wind had taken off the whole top layer of sponge, tossing it into the rhubarb leaves. Ruth said she could only vaguely remember the incident, and I said, trying to clinch it for her memory, the thing was, he got into trouble because that proved he'd been coming down through the rhubarb patch. And that was when Ruth looked at me and said, why? What was wrong with that? It was just the way she said it, suddenly so false, even an onlooker, if there'd been one, would have seen through it. I sighed with irritation and said, Ruth, don't give me that. There's no way you've forgotten. You know that route was out of bounds. Maybe it was a bit sharp the way I said it. Anyway, Ruth didn't back down. She continued pretending to remember nothing, and I got all the more irritated. And that was when she said, what does it matter anyway? What's the rhubarb patch got to do with anything? Just get on with what you were saying. After that, I think we went back to talking in a more or less friendly way, and then before long we were making our way down the footpath in the half-light back to the cottages. But the atmosphere never quite righted itself, and when we said our goodnights in front of the black barn, we parted without our usual little touches on the arms and shoulders. It wasn't long after that I made my decision, and once I'd made it, I never wavered. I just got up one morning and told Keppers I wanted to start my training to become a carer. It was surprisingly easy. He was walking across the yard, his Wellingtons covered in mud, grumbling to himself and holding a piece of piping. I went up and told him, and he just looked at me like I'd bothered him about more firewood. Then he mumbled something about coming to see him later that afternoon to go through the forms. It was that easy. It took a little while after that, of course, but the whole thing had been set in motion, and I was suddenly looking at everything, the cottages, everybody there, in a different light. I was now one of the ones leaving, and soon enough, everyone knew it. Maybe Ruth thought we'd be spending hours talking about my future. Maybe she thought she'd have a big influence on whether or not I'd change my mind. But I kept a certain distance from her, just as I did from Tommy. We didn't really talk properly again at the cottages, and before I knew it, I was saying my goodbyes.